All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here for this webinar. I'm just going to very briefly talk about what our goals are for today with this content. I'm going to spend a little bit of time defining what executive functioning is, and we'll talk about brain areas involved with executive functioning. We're going to do a brief review of how trauma impacts the brain. And so I understand that not all of you were present for the kickoff meeting, so I'll go over some of the key concepts that we discussed during that kickoff meeting about neurobiology of trauma as it relates to impact on executive functions. And we'll go a little bit more into depth in terms of what we see among trauma-impacted populations and their executive functioning, and then we will talk about some educational outcomes, which I understand would be of interest to you all. So why don't we go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so I know some people are on the phone and might not be able to see the visuals. So what we have here is a picture of Dr. Spock, who is sort of like the embodiment of executive functioning, right? So people that are familiar with him know that he is very logical and analytical in his take on the world. And one of the things that he says is that change is the essential process of all existence. And so what does this have to do with what we're going to talk about today? You can think of executive functioning as being a key skill or critical ability that we need in order to adapt our behavior to changing environmental circumstances. So in other words, when we are going through our day and we go from our home environment into our work environment, or maybe we go from our work environment into our social environment, we go out to dinner with friends, that's an example of changing environmental demands, right? So our environment shifts, we need to shift to meet our environment. And so if you think about when kids first enter into school, when they first enter into the educational context, we could say, there's a whole host of new demands, right? There's new social demands in terms of peer relationships and how do I successfully interact with other kids my own age. And then there's a whole set of demands that come along with academic needs. So, I am now for the first time being expected to sit at a desk for long periods of time and stay still and pay attention to the teacher when they're talking. And I need to be able to filter out the person that's sitting next to me that might be throwing spitballs at me. And I need to navigate all sorts of things during recess. So there's a lot of changing environmental demands that come along with school entry. Executive functioning, intact executive functioning is a really critical skill that kids need in order to be able to navigate those new demands successfully. We can go to the next slide, please. So just to define in what we're talking about when we say executive functions, it's a fancy way of talking about sort of the higher order cognitive skills that we all have that allow us to do things like focus, stop a prepotent response, which is called inhibition. And so if you're sitting next to a kid in class who's trying to get you to engage in conversation with them, or maybe they're annoying you and you feel like hitting them and you can stop yourself from doing those things, that's an example of inhibition. So it's kind of our mental braking system. Our ability to initiate or start a new task, get going on something. So if I'm going home at the end of the day and I need to get going on my homework, I need to have the ability to initiate that set of things that need to happen. Cognitive flexibility, which is our ability to mentally switch between tasks. So for example, a child is going from math class into English class. Those are sort of very different kinds of things in terms of content, and so I need to be able to kind of shift from the thought processes that I might use to think about a book that I've just read into algebra class. So that's an example of cognitive flexibility. We use that ability all of the time in our day-to-day life. People talk about things like multitasking. There actually is no such thing as multitasking. Mentally, you cannot do two things at once. But what you are doing is mentally shifting between tasks very quickly. So if you're going from your email to a phone call or to doing some billing for something, or you're grading students' homework assignments, as you're shifting between those different things, you're not doing them at the same time. You're switching quickly between different tasks. That's called cognitive flexibility. Working memory, which is your ability to kind of hold information in your mind and then use it. So if you think about someone who's sitting and listening to a webinar, for example, and then if you want to apply this information to something else, like you're thinking about a child that you have in one of your classes and how this might apply to them, you need working memory skills to do that. Monitoring, which is being able to pay attention to, take in and use information from your environment, very important for any kind of learning process. Our ability to organize and plan. So if I'm a kid that's coming home at the end of the day and I have 5 homework assignments, how am I going to organize my time so that I can get all of those things done? What am I going to do first, second, and third? And then decision making. So being able to weigh risk versus reward, think about different action plans, think about the possible consequences of my action, which requires some ability to think into the future, which is something that kids who have trauma histories struggle with. So, should I skip class with my friends? That might be fun, but I might get myself into big trouble. That's, sort of decision making. So these are all skills that fall under the umbrella of executive functions. And really, they're things that help us regulate ourselves so that we can adapt to our environment and meet certain goals, right, in our day-to-day life. All right, next slide, please. All right, so disrupted executive functioning, when people display deficits in this area, it is associated with certain reductions in brain activity in the prefrontal cortex, which we're going to talk about briefly. Not yet, go back. The striatum and the caudate nucleus. We're not going to do an in-depth breakdown of different brain areas, but just so you guys kind of know sort of what the literature says about what brain areas are involved in executive functioning. And we already talked about this idea that disruptions here are going to interfere with kids' ability to adapt to different conditions. All right, we can go to the next slide. We can go to the next, okay, there we go. So our first polling question, and should people use the, oh, look at that, a nice little polling box popped up. So do you include in school or classroom specific activities to improve student memory or attention, organizational or decision-making skills, all of the above or none of the above? All right, and I'll let you guys decide when we're ready to move on to the next slide after people have had a chance to answer the question. And now we can see our results. So it looks like over half of the group indicated all of the above. About a quarter of people organizational or decision-making skills, and 13% memory or attention, and only 6% none of the above. Okay, that's great. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to watch a very short video. And just to set this up for you all, what you're going to see is something called the marshmallow test. So this is a experiment that's used in psychology. I'm not going to tell you what it's trying to measure. We'll just watch it and then I'll see if you guys have any thoughts on that. But what you will see are kids around 4 or 5 years of age, and the experimenter has them go into a room and sit at a table and puts a marshmallow in front of them and says, you can eat the marshmallow now, or you can wait some period of time. I don't remember if it's 5 minutes or 15 minutes. And if you can wait to eat the marshmallow, when I come back, I'm going to give you 2 marshmallows. All right, so let's just watch it and see how the kids do with this. Okay, I'm not hearing sound for the video.
Stephanie, unmute yourself.
All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. I'm gonna go do something and then I'll come back. It's yummy. All right, so it's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay. All right, so I'm going to leave and then I'll come back, okay? You can either eat it right now or you can wait. Either way, okay? Okay. How'd you do? Did you do good? You did? You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. But I tell you, I'll give you another one. Okay, now you can have both. You need them.
All right, so I'm going to ask people to use the chat box and think about the different executive functioning skills that we just talked about, and what of those do you think the kids were or maybe were not using as they were trying to wait to get that second marshmallow? Okay, so some of the responses that we have coming in are inhibition, decision-making, self-control, self-regulation. What will really happen if I wait or don't wait? So there's some decision-making there, planning, delayed gratification, very good, that's what this measures. So, you know, this is a very simple activity, right? They're just being told to ask to wait to eat that yummy treat, right? But actually, these kids are using all sorts of cognitive skills to do that waiting. They have to stop themselves from eating the yummy marshmallow. It smells good. Maybe they're shifting their attention away from the marshmallow. They're using something to distract themselves. They have to be able to hold in. The experimenter told me she was going to come back and give me a different marshmallow. all of those kinds of things. So there's all sorts of stuff going on with executive functioning just with this very simple task. Now, there's another version of this experiment called the unreliable experimenter version of the experiment. And in that version of the experiment, what they do is right before the child goes into the room where they have to sit down and wait for the marshmallow, they have an interaction with the experimenter where the experimenter promises to do something and then they don't follow through, right? So they kind of, you know, betray the child's trust in a very small way. And so what happens is the kids that are in that condition of having that interaction where somebody didn't follow through on what they said they were going to do, they don't wait for the second marshmallow. They go ahead and eat the marshmallow. And again, very simple, but kind of shows us for kids who've been through lots of experiences where their trust has been betrayed, people haven't followed through for them, they've been through experiences of trauma and adversity, they might not trust that things are going to happen the way that they should, and so that's going to impact the way that they go about in the world. Now, this experiment does measure delayed gratification. That's what the concept is called. And there's some controversy now, you know, in the research world about whether or not delayed gratification is really a good predictor of academic competence or not. But one of the findings is that they found longitudinally is that kids who have an ability to delay gratification, you know, sort of show indicators of success across all different areas of their life, one of them being school. But there's been some studies that have come out recently that show if you fail to control for certain things like socioeconomic background and that kind of stuff, those effects go away. So again, a little bit controversial, but interesting nonetheless. All right, let's go on to the next slide. This is just a study that shows that changes in executive functioning mediate the relationship between exposure to trauma and different kinds of clinical symptoms. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this except to say that we know that trauma disrupts executive functioning, which in turn leads to other problems. So one way to think about it is that deficits in executive functioning might be a mechanism that underlies a lot of different challenges that we see among kids who have histories of trauma, including things like PTSD, but also externalizing problems or behavior problems. All right, we can go on to the next slide and go on to the next one. So we're going to spend a little bit of time just talking about the role of the brain. And again, this is the part for those of you that were at the kickoff meeting. It's going to be a little bit of review, but is important for sort of understanding impact on executive functioning. So remember we spoke about the #1 job of the brain is to ensure survival, ensure that the body survives. And so when someone is going through an experience where their life is threatened, the brain is going to operate in a different way than it does when we're going about sort of day-to-day life. We can go on to the next slide. Click one more time. There we go. So one of the areas of the brain that gets impacted by trauma is the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that's right behind your eyeballs. It's one of the last brain areas to develop. It's part of our neocortex, which is, you know, very well developed in human beings. And, you know, there's lots of parts or areas of that sort of distinguish us from other mammals. But this is kind of where executive functioning skills are housed. And we're going to talk about some studies that show changes in either the structural or functional aspects of the prefrontal cortex. Sometimes the prefrontal cortex gets referred to as the rational brain or wise mind in sort of mindfulness circles, but it's all kind of one and the same. And you can go to the next slide. So what happens during a traumatic event or during a time when a child might be triggered? So something in their environment or something inside like a memory causes them to have a strong reaction that is reminiscent of what happened during the traumatic event. During a traumatic event, the survival response kicks in, right? So we talked about this last time. And when the survival response kicks in, the prefrontal cortex becomes impaired. So the prefrontal cortex is not working as it is when you're not experiencing a trauma. And that's as it should be, because again, the #1 job of the brain is to make sure the body survives. So if you're in a life-threatening situation, you want to be able to react very quickly and almost reflexively. So you don't want to stop and think about all sorts of different options. You just need to take action. And so there's another part of the brain that's called the defense circuitry. We're not going to go into that in any level of detail today, but that brain network sort of comes up and takes control, and part of what happens is it shuts down or impairs the prefrontal cortex, and the automatic survival response takes over. So kids who are growing up in environments where they're steeped in trauma or they're steeped in adversity, they're going to have been in survival mode more often than not, right? So they may have spent most of their time in survival mode where their prefrontal cortex is impaired, not working very well. Because the brain develops in a use-dependent fashion, which means that the more that you do something, it's like riding a bike or driving a car. The more you do something, the more rote and easy it becomes to do that action again. It's the same thing with the brain. Brain areas that get used are going to develop, and brain areas that don't get used are not going to develop very well. So the brain develops in a use-dependent fashion. If the prefrontal cortex is consistently being impaired because somebody is in an environment where they're often under threat and they need to be in survival mode, they don't have a chance to exercise that muscle as much, that prefrontal cortex muscle. You could think about it in that way. And so we see deficits, or we see changes in how that part of the brain is working, and that gets reflected in kids' behavior and their ability to engage in school and all sorts of other things that can become problematic for them. All right, we can go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to go into some of the research that looks at changes on the brain level for both kids, and there's some examples of adult studies sprinkled in here as well that sort of show how the brain is impacted by trauma. So all of the research that I'm going to review next is with populations who have experienced traumatic events, and for the most part, it's some form of chronic trauma, such as chronic early neglect or physical abuse or psychological or emotional maltreatment. We're not talking about studies of samples where somebody is in a car accident or they have a one-time acute traumatic event. The research that I'm going to talk about now is for individuals who have some form of chronic trauma or adversity. So we can go on to the next slide. So this first study that I'm going to show you is in a sample of kids who had very extreme and chronic early neglect. And so if you're familiar with, you know, there's been some stuff in the media, not recently, but some time ago, about kids who are in kind of institutionalized orphanage environments in Eastern Europe, so in Romania and Russia. These are kids who had sort of physical needs met. They had a roof over their heads, they were being fed, and those kinds of things. But as infants, they did not receive adequate nurturance or care in terms of being held, being comforted when they were upset, those kinds of things. So we see very serious attachment disruptions among these kids. But what this slide is showing you is some data on their brain activity. And so what they did is they actually did EEGs with these kids, which is, if you've ever seen a picture of somebody that has that cap on their head that has like all sorts of little circles, it's an EEG cap. It actually measures the electrical activity of the brain. And they did that for these kiddos, and they measured their EEG activity at a couple of different time points and looked at an indicator of what's called cortical maturity. So they looked at alpha activity, and alpha is a type of brain activity that is present when you are in a state where you're not over aroused, but you're able to pay attention. So you're not sleepy or tired, you're kind of in that good optimal arousal zone. And alpha activity is an indicator of what's called cortical maturity. So it's how well the brain is developed. Is the child kind of on track given their age and that kind of thing? And what we see with this study is that kids who had this very chronic early neglect, their cortical maturity is much lower than either children who were never in an institutionalized environment or children who were in that environment early on but were adopted or put into an enriched environment before the age of 2. And they followed these kids over time. I think they followed them through age maybe 10 or 12 at this point. And the children who did not have any kind of early intervention or who did not have any intervention at all continue to show these kind of deficits over time. So it's just sort of gives you a sense, and this is across the entire cortex. So it's the frontal lobe, but it's also other parts of the brain that are involved in sensory integration and all sorts of different things. But just shows that overall their brains are not sort of awake as much as other kids. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, some other challenges that we see among kids who've experienced maltreatment and trauma is in what's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is just a subdivision of the prefrontal cortex. The terminology isn't really important, but this part of the prefrontal cortex is really critical for planning, organization, being able to regulate your body, and then being able to take in sensory information and stuff like that from the environment and integrate it with other information, and also in working memory. And so among kids who've experienced early maltreatment, we see deficits in this part of the brain in terms of how well it functions that are linked to problems with inhibition. So it's kind of like the brain's braking system, mental braking system, is not working as well among kids who've experienced maltreatment. And so what we see is they're not able to control those impulses. They're not able to stop themselves from hitting Johnny next to them in class when they get annoyed, or from acting out or different things like that. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. This is another study which shows you some fancy pictures from an fMRI scanner. What this study is showing is that this is a study of adults, adults who had a history of emotional maltreatment, which is a type of trauma that tends to kind of fly under the radar, doesn't get paid attention to quite as much. So these are individuals who had an emotional maltreatment history but had not experienced things like physical or sexual abuse, that they had a significant reduction in an area of the brain that's really critical for ability to regulate emotion, ability to reflect upon behaviors and make good decisions. And this is called the medial prefrontal cortex, again, another subdivision of the prefrontal cortex. And so, a few of you mentioned in the chat box when you were watching the kids with the marshmallow that they were able to regulate themselves pretty well, right, to wait for that second marshmallow. And so what this study is telling us is that the part of the brain that's really critical for that regulation process is underactive. So it's not working as well for individuals who have histories of trauma and maltreatment. That's what that red area is showing you. That's the difference between people who have maltreatment histories and people that don't have maltreatment histories in terms of their brain activity. And anything that's red or orange is showing a significant difference in terms of brain activity. All right, you can go on to the next slide. All right. Another area where we see disruptions in kids who have histories of maltreatment and trauma is in an area called the anterior cingulate. And this part of the brain, you can see it on the picture, it's the part that's kind of highlighted in pink. And if you know anything about brain anatomy, you've got the prefrontal cortex there in the front that's in yellow, and then the anterior cingulate, and then behind that is what's called the limbic system or the emotional brain. That's where the defense circuitry is housed. And the anterior cingulate is kind of like the bridge between the prefrontal cortex and the parts of our brain that are more in charge of emotional responses, for lack of a better term. And so it's really important for things like our ability to be aware that we're experiencing a particular emotion, be able to put words to it, be able to modulate that response so that we don't, blow out of the water and yell at our boss if we're feeling upset. It's important in attention, it's important in inhibition, and also in decision-making and learning. And so folks who have child maltreatment histories and PTSD, this part of the brain isn't working very well. And so, as a therapist, I sort of think about how this might impact my clients, where they're coming in and we're trying to talk about feelings, and we're trying to talk about how do they sort of make linkages between you know, their reaction to a situation and what that might be bringing up for them from their previous history. For those of you that are, you know, working with kids in a school context, this part of the brain would be important for, you know, you have a child who is having a hard time, or they're acting out in class, or they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and then you're going back to them and trying to get some sense of like, what happened there? What was going on there when you hit, you know, Johnny who's sitting next to you? And the kid says, I don't know. Because they really don't know, because the part of their brain that helps them know that information isn't working so well. And if you think about, you know, kids who are kind of reacting to things in their environment, maybe they're getting triggered by things in their environment, their prefrontal cortex is not working so well, and that's going to impair this process even more. So the research that we're looking at, this is measuring brain processes under conditions of like low emotional arousal. So somebody's lying in the scanner. If you guys are familiar with fMRI scanner, it's like a big round sort of like thing that you go into. They load you in there, and then you're doing a task on the computer while they're measuring your brain activity. So it's not very emotionally arousing. You know, it's not like sitting in class with all these other children around you. There might be noises that are triggering you, or smells, or different things. And even under those conditions of low emotional arousal, this part of the brain isn't working very well. So we can imagine if you layer onto that, a child is triggered, their prefrontal cortex is impaired, this process is going to be even more impaired than we see in the study here. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Okay. Another thing that we see pretty consistently among populations who have trauma histories, and there's been a number of studies that have been done on this, is disruptions in the parts of the brain that are involved in evaluating and responding to reward. And this is part of the brain is called the striatum. But among kids with the early deprivation histories that we've already talked about, children with RAD, which is reactive attachment disorder, has a different name in the new version of the DSM. But children who are diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder kind of by definition have very significant early attachment disruption and then resulting behavioral challenges that are linked to that. Maltreated kids who have depressive symptoms, and also among adults who have histories of trauma and maltreatment, we see disruptions in the brain pathway that's involved in evaluating reward. Now, this is important because our ability to recognize and respond to rewards, or have rewards give us a good feeling, is really important for learning. So, you know, some children are very intrinsically motivated. You know, it might be rewarding to them to get a good grade. Some kids might be more extrinsically motivated. So they want to get good grades because their parent told them, I'll take you out for ice cream at the end of the week if you have good behavior, whatever. So among kiddos who have histories of maltreatment, this part of the brain is not working all that well. So they are not going to be as motivated by rewards. Rewards aren't going to feel as good to them as other kids. And so, you know, again, bringing my therapist perspective to the table, what do I tell parents that I work with all the time when they're trying to change behavior? Well, use positive reinforcement. Right? That's something that we all are told and learn is much better than using punishment. And it is much better than using punishment. But for children who have a trauma history, the rewards aren't as rewarding on a brain level. So when we see kids who are, you know, sort of, they're not getting that good feeling from completing an assignment, or from getting a good grade, or being successful somehow in class, you know, they might appear more depressed or things like that. This might be part of what's going on. Or for kids who are having challenges in terms of completing work and things like that, you know, we have to be really consistent with the rewards, and we might need to change the rewards up. We might need to be thinking about talking with them about what works. But just in terms of learning, important concept that the reward system is not working quite as well as it might be for other children. All right, we can go to the next slide. And this is just the task that they use to measure this is based on abstract reward. So, just in thinking about whether or not that may or may not be translatable to something like the classroom, there may be other things around relationship and attachment that are very rewarding to kids who've experienced trauma that sort of fall outside of this experimental paradigm that you might think about in terms of motivation. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so just to review some of the research in terms of what we know, in terms of what we see behaviorally. So we've talked about some of the underlying challenges in terms of brain functioning, but what do we actually see from kids who have histories of trauma? They have a range of deficits when it comes to executive functions. And again, I should have said this earlier, but just because a child has a history of trauma does not mean that it's a done deal that they're going to have these challenges, but it is more likely for children who've had that kind of experience that they're going to have challenges with executive functioning, but many kids are resilient, and so not everybody has the same outcome. But for kids with histories of trauma, we do see that they have challenges in both auditory and visual attention. And this is a pretty consistent finding across, kids who have different kinds of maltreatment exposures. But if you think again about having to sit in class, listen to the teacher, pay attention to what's being presented to you, children with trauma are going to potentially have more difficulty with that because it's harder for them to focus. Poor inhibitory control is a pretty consistent one. We see that expressed as a lot of behavioral problems. This is something that we see in the research across the age range. We see it in kids, we see it in adolescents, we see it in adults. And so the combination of these two things results in kids with histories of trauma having high rates of diagnosis of things like ADHD, which may or may not be true, quote unquote, true ADHD. It may be that they are getting triggered and reacting to triggers. Their prefrontal cortex becomes impaired and it's difficult for them to attend, to control their behaviors, not because they have ADHD per se, but because their brain is going into survival mode, right? Among kids who have extreme early deprivation, their level of challenge in this area is even higher than what we see among sort of quote unquote standard ADHD cases. So they might look like a very extreme case of ADHD when in fact what's going on is they're responding to trauma triggers and getting dysregulated and blowing out of class or whatever we sort of see. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Oh wait, we went one too far. Go back one. There we go. Sorry, I didn't start talking because this one looks very similar to the last one. In terms of IQ, this is one way that researchers measure sort of cognitive capacity, which is not necessarily the best measure for all groups, but it's one of the ones that we have and we have quite a bit of information on. What's interesting, I think, about the research on IQ is that while we do see that kids with maltreatment histories tend to score lower on IQ tests, that when you look at studies of adults, there is no difference between adults who have histories of trauma and those who do not have histories of trauma in terms of how they do an IQ testing, which is interesting because it suggests that there's some process that's helping this to normalize across development. So there's ways in which kids are able to catch up. I don't know if you guys remember during the first talk, I think I mentioned that some of the changes that happen in the brain in terms of the hippocampus and memory can be corrected by an enriched environment. So I think there's something to be said around brain plasticity and that, there's, while kids may show challenges early on, there's chance for intervention to correct that and to help them sort of catch up and get back to where they need to be. There's also a dose-response relationship between maltreatment severity and lower IQ, and that the more maltreatment you've had and the more severe the maltreatment is, the more of an impact we see on IQ. And for those of you that are kind of familiar with IQ testing, which I'm assuming many of you are, and sort of what sort of makes that up is there's a component of the test that's what we would refer to as kind of crystallized intelligence, or what you learn, in school or in your environment, like, being able to define certain words or things like that. And then there's a separate component that measures fluid intelligence, which is more problem-solving ability and kind of abstract reasoning and things like that. The thinking is, among people that study IQ and cognitive development, is that crystallized intelligence is very heavily dependent on your environment and what you're exposed to, while fluid intelligence may or may not be sort of more biologically driven. So there is a lot of room for intervention to make a difference for kids. The earlier that intervention happens, the better. But it's interesting to know that among adults, we don't see a difference. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. In terms of some of the academic outcomes that we see among kids who have histories of trauma, they do show poor academic performance. Again, as a group, this isn't true for all kids, but across a range of different kinds of indicators. They're less likely to graduate, they're more likely to be held back, and whatever sort of gaps exist early on tend to widen and persist across elementary school. So I put that in here just to sort of highlight, again, like the critical role that we can play in terms of sort of intervening as early as possible and providing kids with tools and skills to help them address the regulation difficulties so that they can get off that trajectory of having some of these achievement gaps. And I just sort of put this map on the bottom, which is sort of how I think about it, which is that trauma is impacting kids' executive functioning. When they have these executive functioning deficits, it makes it much more difficult for them to do well in school. So they might have poor academic outcomes. They also have higher rates and odds of having mental health and behavioral issues, and those two things feed into each other, right? So if you have a child in class who's acting out or really having trouble, being able to be in the classroom in a safe way, and they're, having to go to the principal's office all the time or whatever it is, that's going to also influence their academic outcomes. If they're having poor academic outcomes, that may influence their self-esteem and contribute to things like depression and anxiety. So it's kind of a two-way street between those mental health and behavioral challenges and their academic outcomes, is sort of how I think about it. All right, let's go to the next slide. We're doing good on time. I think we're going to get through everything. So another really interesting way to think about executive functioning is that we have a real opportunity to support resilience, because executive functioning can be sort of thought of as this modifiable resilience factor. So an area where we can focus and use different kinds of interventions like mindfulness, yoga, body-based interventions. There's all sorts of different ways to approach it to bolster that executive functioning for kids, which is then going to help support their success in school. So kids who have strong executive functioning skills have better school readiness. They're better able to participate in class, which for obvious reasons, considering the sort of, things that fall under this category. They're more self-reliant, they're better motivated, they're more able to be persistent, right? So like, this new idea about like sort of life success is based partly on like what we're born with, but partly with our grit. That's kind of like the new terminology that's being used. That grit is persistence. It's your ability to like keep at something and overcome obstacles and things like that. In order to be able to do that, you need to have intact executive functioning. And executive functioning's, predictive of a range of different academic outcomes. And these skills are malleable. So, we've talked about this idea that the brain develops in a use-dependent fashion. The prefrontal cortex is one of the last brain areas to develop, and it's one of the areas of the brain that's most plastic, meaning there's the most like room for improvement potentially across the lifespan. So they're malleable, which means they can change and be influenced by both positive and negative experiences. So while trauma may have disrupted their development in terms of executive functioning, intervention can sort of get things back on track. And there is an emerging literature now that shows that different kinds of mindfulness interventions really help to support and bolster the development of executive functioning. And there's a number of folks that are doing research on this issue, most notably Phil Zalazzo, if you want to look some of it up. But again, just knowing that that part of the brain is still developing, especially during adolescence, there's lots of room for us to, as providers, be able to sort of get kids on a better developmental trajectory if they have experienced trauma. Okay, so I think those are all of my pieces, and we're going to go to a couple more polling questions. So do we want to go to the next slide? Okay, so I will go ahead and, okay, so the polling question that's coming up on my screen is the same as the first question that we did at the beginning. Do you include in-school classroom specific activities to improve student memory or attention, etc.? It's not reflecting this new polling question.
Stephanie, when you go to the polling, just click the down button and it'll say question 2. I can see question 2 on my screen.
So I'll just, while we're doing that, I'll read the question. Interventions to enhance EF include mindfulness, yoga, meditation, protective adults, and predictability, things like routines and expectations. At your school or in your classroom, to what extent are you implementing any of these kinds of interventions? And your choices are regularly, often, sometimes, a little, or not at all.
Can everyone see it?
I can see it now, yeah. Now I can see
Okay,
question
great.
2.
Cool.
Okay, so here's our results. 8% are using these kind of interventions regularly, 42% use them often, about a quarter of folks use them sometimes or a little, and 0 use them not at all. That's awesome. And we do have a question for the group in the chat box from Dana. I would love to hear which interventions people are using at their schools. And then something from Jill, is this webinar something we could use with our school participants? Fine with me. Do we want to go on to just the, I just have one summary slide that I'll do really quick, and then maybe we'll have some time for Q&A. Okay, so just to summarize what we've talked about, I mean, the sort of take-home message is that for kids who have histories of trauma-impacted children, their brains might be just less equipped to respond effectively to the demands of school. And part of that is due to these disruptions that we've been talking about in executive functioning, which contribute both to mental health and behavioral difficulties and cognitive challenges. And all of that is going to potentially disrupt their academic success. But we do know from emerging research that interventions that really focus on building regulation can help to bolster executive functioning and help kids engage in school more successfully.